Hello, this is the podcast from the international research platform SIMM, with reports and interviews from across the world on the role music can play in social and community programs. I am Lucas Perron. During this episode of the SIMM-podcast, we talk and reflect about which music is chosen or composed in participatory social and community music projects. We talk about the music. We interview composer Fiona Evison, trumpetist and practitioner in social music projects Bart Maris, composer and educator Georgia Nicolaou, and conductor and composer Patrick Murray. Fiona, Georgia, and Patrick are also developing research on these questions. Fiona Evison, welcome to the SIMM-podcast. I'm curious to interview you on the topic of this episode, which is about the music that is being played and proposed and created within social and community music projects. I saw the presentation that you're preparing for the symposium in Paris, which is very much about this, and I wrote about relational composition. And
my interest in composition stems out of my community music practice. I've been involved in community musicking for almost 40 years, but it wasn't until maybe the last 6 or 7 years that I turned to composition as a way to engage in a different way with the people that I was making music with. And when I went back to do some graduate studies, I wondered if there was actually a place for the composer in the community music field. And the reason why I asked that question was because I was reading a lot of works that really focused on a bottom-up approach, so something that was very democratic. And it seemed to me that in the literature, I was having a hard time finding much mention of composers at all. So there seemed to be quite a large gap, and I wondered if that was because of a philosophical reason. So when I turned to Christopher Small's book on musicking,
yes.
He had quite a lot to say about composers, and it wasn't all very flattering, and it certainly did not reflect the way that I was working as a composer. Mm-hmm. So I decided that I would do some research. And I did a very large international research project where I interviewed 33 composers from around the world who were working with communities using composition as a way to engage with the participants in very many different ways. So that was really, really interesting, and it actually did show me that there was definitely a place for the composer.
Yeah. And so that there's more going on than appeared at first in this field, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm still kind of wondering why there hasn't been more talk about it. Uh-huh. But one of the reasons is because they tend to not call themselves composers necessarily. They might refer to themselves as just a facilitator, or a songwriter. But there are actually those who do consider themselves composers, and they have no problem with that term. Mm-hmm. But the way that they practice their compositional work is on a relational level that is quite different from what we would perhaps think about if we thought about an art music composer, very isolated, insisting on a certain way of writing the music that is their vision alone. And
although that's not also very often not the case also. I have been working with the Ictus, the Belgian Ictus Ensemble, contemporary music ensemble, and the composers we've been working with, they really they needed to be more than just in touch with our musicians, and so to be able to try out things and to discuss possibilities, not only technical but also ideas, music compositional ideas. So I think also in the art scene there's also a lot of collaboration sought with performers, and between composers and composers.
The thing that is interesting is that it seems to be in the mind of sort of society in general that they still have this image of the heroic composer, the genius, slightly insane perhaps, just working all night long. But that actually does not reflect the way that many composers are working now.
And then in community music projects, the position of the composer can maybe per definition become very different, and so you call it relational composition.
Relational composition. So I developed that theory based on the data that I collected, and it really talked about how composers could become a part of a community through a continuum of compositional activity. So that meant that they certainly might be very involved in really participatory, democratic, inclusive, accessible kind of music making, but they might also have been working with, a string quartet. So they tended to not really want to be boxed into a certain thing that they're only going to work in a certain way. The majority of the composers that I interviewed wanted to be involved in their communities. They wanted to make music that would be a benefit to people. They wanted the process to be beneficial. It was not about necessarily their reputation as an artist and their artistic vision, but working in different kinds of ways. Now, I did actually interview a composer who was actually not interested at all in that kind of work. And so that interview gave me something to kind of compare the two locations. And so, when we think about that, again, that heroic composer, there are still composers that are really committed to only working with professionals. It's very much about their artistic vision. But as we said before, there are many, probably, I'm not sure if I could say many more, but there certainly are many that are interested in working in a relational way.
That seek these collaborative processes,
And part of what I found was that they had different values that were important to them. And so as a result, they had different goals for their music.
In community music projects and social music projects, it's often considered important to include also the musical realities of the people participating in these programs, the kids and the young people and the not so young people who are participating in these community music programs. So if the composer is capable, able, has a talent to listen to this potential input and to include it into the final results, this can be quite a challenge, but also a very positive element in this work.
Yes, well, so many of them commented on how it required a different set of skills to be able to include everybody in the room, not just the highly skilled. Yes, university or college or in the academy somewhere did not necessarily prepare them for working with a variety of different levels and also with people who are not trained professionally to be musicians. So they were learning sometimes from other composers, or they were learning as they did the projects to see what would work, what wouldn't work. But they felt that it actually required more skill to work this way than just to assume that everybody has a very high level of ability and to write things that are very, very difficult.
Is it something that one can learn, that one can be trained for, you think?
Well, that is very interesting because I'm actually interested in researching that idea a little bit more. I do believe that it is possible. Now, whether or not it's likely to happen, it would be another thing to discuss. Because
do you know examples? Do you know examples of initiatives, training initiatives in this field?
There's not really a lot of examples to share. I've been starting to look for them, and it's really a developing field, I would say. Mm-hmm. Most composition professors have been trained by another composition professor. So it's very much that idea of, the disciple learning from the master and kind of passing it all mm-hmm. down. So if you are being taught by somebody who has never worked in this way, how are they going to have the skills to teach you how to do that? It's not that easy if you think about it from that perspective. The other thing that I did find was that if a composer were to write in that way, it might not always be graded or received well by their professors. So they might say, well, this music, the things that make that music really work well for a community group do not necessarily make it work well in a high art situation. So you cannot really judge the two based on the same criteria, and yet that is often the situation that was faced. They actually need to be really well skilled in working with people and in listening and understanding, working with a diverse group of people, knowing how, having some insights on how they might approach a project that would be able to include multiple skills, different ages. Maybe they might have to actually be involved as a director as well as just the composer. So they will actually be in that musical project, not somebody who has written it and then passed it along to somebody else.
Outside,
right? So a number of those different kinds of skills, how to, problem solve and overcome issues, how to manage the process so that, for example, if you're trying to get ideas from an entire group, sometimes within a group you might have somebody who's really dominant and has lots and lots of ideas. You might have other people that you're trying to draw out. So how do you balance that process so that you are hearing from everybody and not just the person with the loudest voice? Those aren't necessarily things that you're going to learn in a composition course in the academy, right? So, those are the kinds of skills that I was thinking of. Also, if you want to try and include as many people as possible, then you need to really have a sort of a bag of tricks that will help you to do that, how to incorporate lots of people in creative ways. And I felt very moved by the projects, the kind of work that these composers are doing. I would often find myself in tears or with goosebumps, listening to them talk. They often were in tears, talking about the kind of work that they're doing. One composer is working in a hospice situation. So he will go in and he will spend time with somebody who is, basically at the end of their life. And they will work together on a composition project. And if the time allows for it, then they will be able to hear that composition being, maybe sung by a group of school children, and the family will be there. But sometimes that doesn't take place until after that person has died. So that just feels like really, really meaningful work. It brings so much healing and comfort to the families, And when you think about those kind of values of love and care for other people and how you might be able to use your skill and your interest in writing music in order to bring that about in a very loving, humanitarian way, then it just, for me, it's on a whole different level of realizing a perfect artistic product.
Fiona, in the interviews, the meetings I have and the interviews now for the podcast, I come across regularly musicians who are not positioning themselves as composers, but who are doing composition work within social and community music projects. And I would like to hear your ideas about this as a composer. Do you think that's something to look down on, or do you think that's something to be applauded and to be developed, that musicians and singer, trumpet player, different musicians who don't have the composition training, but who within this context of social and community work start composing with the people that they work with the participants?
I think it's a beautiful thing, and I think it's actually a sign of being a healthy musician, in that you have lots of different ways that you can express your music and work with others in a musical way. So I certainly don't believe that it's only the composers who should be allowed to do that. And I think that a lot of people who might have been trained in composition, they actually set that term aside because they felt that it didn't really reflect the kind of work that they were doing. So I find that actually interesting too, that you might have, a degree in composition, but you're not calling yourself a composer. You're calling yourself a facilitator or a community musician, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It says something interesting about the values that are maybe associated with that term composer.
Bart Maris, so good to have you again in the SIMM-podcast. We want to talk about the music which is being proposed, played, maybe composed together in what is called participatory social music projects. So as you have yourself a lot of experience with this, and you care, not just experience, but you also, I know, care very much about how you can bring together not only people, but also their music. And so the floor is yours.
The floor is mine. Well, there is no recipe. There is no recipe for it. I've been thinking about this question, Lucas, over and over, going through all the projects. I've done projects where we would ask participants like, hey, you can come up with material. And there were situations where this would break the ice, and there were situations where this would block.
Yes.
Because music is a genius way of launching communication between people. But what we underestimated is that music is carrying this, this identity of groups. And when music for us is exotic, that's okay. I mean, like, we don't have the connection, but then somebody singing a song that is related to I don't know what can, for another participant of another origin, like, be a real shock. And the problem is that you, as a leader of a session, I don't have this kind of knowledge of all these delicate things. Like, for instance, that was really, for me, it was a try. I did a workshop with new coming migrants in Brussels. I have this workshop I do, like, I teach people to play a brass instrument in 1 hour. which is impossible, but it's just to give them the fun, the experience of blowing the instrument.
Making some sound.
Making some sound as a group. This is very important. Making some sound as a group. So because to make them feel how this approach organizes a group completely different and in a completely abstract way, they can redefine at the moment. But in the examples, I play some tunes for them, I show them the instruments. And I did a project in Germany where we would play all national anthems as a kind of song form for improvisation, like John Zorn does with these Jewish based tunes. And I thought, well, and we had in this project we had a Syrian anthem. And I thought, okay, I played the Syrian anthem, and I was curious. And suddenly, like, one of the guys picked his smartphone, started to Google, and showed the smartphone to me, and there was the Syrian anthem sounding very loud out of his smartphone. And I said, well, may I ask you, sir, how do you think about this? And he said, like, well, the Syrian anthem is our anthem. It's not Assad's. It's nobody's. It's the Syrian identity. Nobody can claim this. And for me, that was like, okay. Because I found it kind of delicate to play it. So in other situations where we would use tunes, it would block. Like we had this in the Tozo situation. We had people from
the Austin Street
Orchestra.
Street Orchestra.
We had people from Kurdish origin. We had people from Syrian origin. We had people from... and once, especially the Turkish people, bring up their music, they want to impose also the rules of playing the music together. And this is organizing the group in a kind of, how to say, hierarchical way, where the guy that brings on the tune controls the situation. And so it's really counterproductive for getting confidence. So what I did in most of the situations when I worked with people is like I try to create. Because if you create something together, it's the identity of the group. And of course, like when you create, it's always like...
Because it's made by this group with these
it's
people.
It's made by this group and it's their music. And also, as the creation process goes on, they can find their place. And you can read their characters. Like there will be people that will be very shy to add. There will be people that take a lot of initiative, that will try to be very prominent present. And like this, it defines the character of musicians participating, which is also, I think, a very social element. And as a workshop leader, this is what I most try to control.
It takes time, no?
And that's another thing, Lucas. Yes, it's like most of the time, projects don't have this much time. It's like you do 10 sessions, which is already a lot. And then organizers go like, okay, what's the result? And that's in fact, this is imposing a lot of stress on this kind of situations, because when you start the workshop, you're already there knowing like, hey, in 5 or 6 weeks from now, we should have like a defined result that we can start to train to get it on a higher level.
Yeah.
You go looking for some ready-made solutions quite quick to save situations. And sometimes this looking for a ready-made result will block the creation process. And this was the typical thing with the Ostend Street Orchestra. We were 3 people leading the orchestra. Giovanni Barcella, he's a free improvising drummer. Ilse Duik, she's a jazz singer. And me.
Yes.
And in fact, most of the time, we never played tunes. We had a certain procedure of creating. And what we would do on stage is starting to make music the same way we make it on the rehearsal. Which is, of course, a kind of, sometimes the result was bad. I have to admit. Yes. But what happens is that you really give the responsibility to the musicians, to the people participating. So this is the difficult thing. Like what we had this kind of, we would call it like more kind of scenarios. And what can define a situation? It's like the configuration of the group. You would say like, okay, let us start with the guitars. No drums yet, no drums, not the bass, no, not the horns. The guitar start. We will have the voices doing something. And then when this is established, there's something happening. Of course, the voices would use pre-prepared texts. This was like, we had a lot of text and we make selection in the text. And these texts will be recited. And we loop. Looping is a very important principle. You find phrases that work and you repeat them. And this was like, we had most of the times like 4 or 5 voices together. And Ilse was leading them and in this kind of repetition process on stage. So we would really on cue go from one phrase to the other, repeat it, revocalize it. And then slowly we bring in the other elements because we know like once you launch the elements, they go a bit their independent, they take their independent place and they want to they want to establish their energy. And then at a certain point, they will come back to you when they have told their story. They look at you as a leader, like, how do we get out of this? And then what is like, I can make these cues, like, if you want to finish now, you can stop. I make this kind of cueing process. And I have to say, I was playing with this project on the 21st of June by Metics. They brought like ladybirds were there. There was a fanfare, a social fanfare from Charleroi. There was this Babalouse from Michel Massot, and there was this project from Metics, which is led by Laurent Blondiot. And they made some tunes, and they would play the tunes. The tunes are lines that are superimposed, so they can launch the lines, stop the lines. But what Laurent would do, and I really love that, is like he would include other elements, because like other elements, I explain myself, like laughing, a kind of minimal acting, like freezing the image. And I thought, like, you sure this working, Laurent? But I was amazed because I stood there in between the participants. At a certain point, Laurent gives the cue for these 100 musicians standing together to freeze and not move anymore. And what happens is he's breaking the code. A public has an expectation, and the musician also. When you go on a stage, a public has the idea, okay, these guys know what they're gonna do, and they're gonna play music for us. And the moment you break this code, the situation changes, and everybody's surprised, and the role changes. Like, okay, the platform is not only a music platform anymore; it can be something else. It can be acting. It can be like, certain point he gives the sign, and in the middle of the tune, everybody stops and start to laugh at the audience very loud. And you see this audience looking like, what do you mean? So it's breaking the ice. These small things are so wonderful, and this is about like perception. Like if, and I think especially in
I imagine also that it then also becomes an exciting experience for the audience because they don't know what's happening and what's next, what's coming next.
That's it. Yeah. No, and that's it. Like, that's it. And this makes them, how to say, this catches their attention. Yes. It keeps the attention very vigilant. It's and this is it. And I think if you go for this ready-made result, and you use it as a ready-made result, like we're gonna play music for you as it is, then you copy a situation where the risk is that you cannot fulfill the full mission of it.
I have a question about, you work through preparing a performance at the end, huh?
Yes,
and,
of course.
And you don't want it to be too fixed, and that's what you explained already. But still, you want people, participants, the musicians, the singers, to know where they are and where they're going to. So, and so you have written that down. You called it scenarios.
Yeah, this is one way of doing it, where you really make a scenario, where the participants know where you go to. The other way is that you do it visual direction one.
You give signs showing that you're...
Yeah, you train the cues in advance. And then you feel... Laurent made this remark to me, which I really loved. He said, like, you know, if you do this kind of cues about visual things, about really abstract things for the musicians to do, and you do this with professionals, it fails. Because they cannot step out of the role of being a musician. As the amateur musician, he is not a musician, and he can fulfill this role perfectly.
Fortunately, not all musicians are in this position. We start to...
No. I know. Yeah. But the thing is, and this is for the cues and the scenario.
Yes.
It's like, in fact, as a workshop leader, the only thing I could do is like bring on a multitude of elements, and you try them with the group as it is on the rehearsals we did, and you are very vigilant for, okay, this doesn't work, or they don't, and then you try to find out they don't understand it, or they feel embarrassed doing it, and then other things that you feel like, okay, they go for it. This one, they really grab it, and then you know, like you have cues where you can, out from them doing something, you can, redose their energy.
Yes.
And I think like it's something in music which is very important, especially on the social platform. It's like the management of energy. And it's and the controlling of a group, even if you give it this freedom.
And then it's also good for you not to be on your own, to have colleagues like Laurent and Ilse
It's a luxury situation, Lucas. I have to say, like this situation I work there is very luxury because we were 3 people, and so after doing a rehearsal, we all 3 had a completely different approach. We could discuss about that. Yes, sorry, Gio, but what you do there, I don't think this works. And he would say to me then, yes, I'm convinced it works, but they don't trust me. So the very luxury thing for me in Ostend Street Orchestra was to work with 3 people. So we could evaluate, we could give initiative to each other. And like, as I said, like doing the project with the Ladybirds in Brussels, with the Metex, I was a participant. And this, for me, is also so unique to experience myself. How do approaches of workshop leaders on participants, how does it work?
Not only in terms of what you can propose, if you're several people intervening, you can have more propositions, but also in terms of listening and seeing what's going on with those participating. And it's difficult to do that on your own.
It's very difficult. It's very difficult to take distance. Like also, and this is something that is sometimes forgotten. It's like the workshop leader himself is a human being, and we
can hope so.
It is, and he gets involved emotionally in the way he works.
Yes.
And this emotion working, it's a secret of success, but it's also the danger of failure.
It's also to do with chemistry, which works between you and certain people, and less well with others. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And this is very difficult, and there is no abstract way. This is human interaction. You cannot not have it. And if you then do this with people that come out of a very social, delicate context, their preoccupation is not having a nice afternoon. Their preoccupation is like, what am I going to eat tonight? Oh, if this landlord is coming and I have this problem with this and that, and that, they have a lot of things on their head. So keeping their focus is kind of difficult. And creating this moment is very difficult. And you can only create this moment if the logistics around you permit it. Like the Ostend Street Orchestra in wintertime, we would have like coffee, we would have food.
Yes.
Even sometimes at noon we would have a meal.
Yeah, so the logistics not only in terms of the music accompanying.
No. Yes. No. Especially the thing around. I think like music accommodation, it's good that you have like good instruments and this and this. Yes, that it can be a nice thing. But if you have this, but there is no context, like I felt this like with the Ostend Street Orchestra, what happened is like people would come and sit there because you're in it's winter time and you're inside and it's warm and there's free coffee, there's free cookies, there's free biscuits, there's free apple, there's free cake, and they would sit there and enjoy and talk. And this is very important. This is really important.
Hello, Georgia Nicolaou. Welcome to the SIMM-podcast. You're a composer, you're a performer, and you're doing research as well. And you're from Cyprus, but the last 10 years, about 10 years, you've been mostly active in Holland and the Netherlands and in Belgium. Is that a good short introduction to what you do?
Yes, a very good introduction.
Yes. And so I want to talk with you about the music, which is being played, performed, proposed, created, composed maybe, in social and community work. I would like you to give us some examples of the type of music that you've been coming across.
Since I'm a composer, I mainly work with improvisation, actually, using both music and movement. Improvisation is, of course, a very broad word. By improvisation, I mean that I guide the children to explore the possibilities of the instruments if they have an instrument during the workshop.
Yeah, what kind of instruments can it be?
It can be small. For example, if the children are in a group and they don't have music education or they don't play an instrument, they can use small, easy percussion instruments or flutes, for example, with one note, or boom rackers, or so instruments that they can easily produce a pitched or unpitched sound, and then their voice and their bodies, like body percussion or just sounds produced when moving.
The music is already existing before you start such a project, or is it like composed on the spot together with the kids and the youngsters?
Yes, so it's mainly composed on the spot, but the activities I use are already prepared in advance. So the activity, I can use the same activity for different workshops, for example, but the result can be totally different according to the dynamic of the group or the number of children or the possibilities we have regarding material.
You propose music, and there's also music during the session, music that comes into existence, and it depends who's there, how the groups interact, and what kind of inputs they propose also.
But many times I use a specific style of music as inspiration. For example, I give the children an assignment to bring a traditional song from their country or a song that their family or relatives love. We might listen to the music with a group, like to these traditional songs, and then discuss the different elements of the music and the connection to their tradition.
Uh-huh.
And then they can use this as a source of inspiration to create their own song or find new text or create their own music on the text.
Uh-huh.
So this is also a type of activity I use. Another example is the sounds of nature as inspiration, because I love nature, and I believe that nature can be a really empowering element in music education. For example, I often make sound walks with children, especially if we have a nice forest around. We can have a sound walk and notice thoroughly the sounds of the nature. And we can capture interesting sounds and create music out of it.
So you make recordings with them?
Yes. There are some really great applications, if there is the possibility, of course, of having iPads or tablets. For example, there is an application called Samples and many others, really, really simple, like many sampling applications for children. You can record and edit, cut like the beginning and the end, and have a simple sampling machine to later play or make a composition out of the sounds you recorded. And since children love technology and listening back to what they have recorded can give a great feeling of satisfaction. And it can also contribute to the idea of expanding the standard frame of what music is.
What's the age of the children that you've recently been working with?
Yeah, I mainly work with ages from 9 to 12 or 8 to 12. So children have the basic motor skills to record or to create by themselves. Of course, children in a younger stage, they cannot collaborate or create something in small groups. So this is also very important, the design of these kind of activities.
And where do you do this? Have you been doing this work in Belgium?
I have already worked in an organization in Rotterdam, in a deprived area of South Rotterdam. And I did a series of workshops in the afternoon school of the primary school. Then I worked for the last 3 years with Musica Impulscentrum for Muziek in Belgium. And we do really amazing workshops there.
The research that you're now developing yourself.
Yeah, so as I said, the main aspect is composition, since I'm a composer. The other aspect is improvisation. We composers, but also we musicians that like to create new music, use improvisation as the first source of creation. And then I am greatly interested in combining music and movement. So I approach making music in the same way as I approach making movement with the body. And I explore ways in how the body can make music out of movement. And the other way around. How can we play an instrument with the body to create movement without sound? So I'm really interested in this correlation and co-creation of the whole existence of our body.
Hello, Patrick Murray. Seeing what you're in Paris at the yearly symposium next November will present. This is very much close to the topic that we want to discuss now.
One of the things I was really interested in is this tension between the idea of creating a musical work of art that is in some way fixed and reproducible, and then how a couple of these pieces, that have been designed with an idea of community and engagement and participation around them, how they change as they move between different community contexts in which they have been performed. So, composers who have made room for storytelling or audience participation as an aesthetic choice within their particular musical aesthetic within that piece. Composers who have, deliberately tried to think about, okay, how do I make room for people who don't read music within a musical art form that is largely composed and written down? Or even people who don't consider themselves to be singers to have opportunities to speak. So there are different musical parameters that I found that the composers I was looking at were thinking about in terms of musical elements, and also as well the text. As choral musicians, we always really think a lot about text and what does it mean to us when we sing the music, and who are we embodying, whose stories are we embodying on stage when we sing a particular text. So innovative and different ways that composers are sourcing text, both, I'm not actually sure if I even like that word anymore, but it's a word that often gets used, building text, writing text together. One composer who chose to crowdsource his text from internet searches as an attempt to represent some form of universal human expression. Another composer who was doing a lot of interviews, primary source interviews and archival sources, and incorporating, that sort of written and living oral archive of a community into the text of the music. So both of those on a textual and musical level, I think, really come into play when we think about how people can see themselves reflected and feel able to participate in the construction or presentation of what is still thought of as a musical artwork in some way.
Yes, in Paris, you will focus on the work of one specific composer, Rina Ismail.
That's right.
Because her work is very much in line with some of what you just mentioned in terms of participatory music making.
Mm-hmm. So Rina's piece that I use as a case study, just to think through issues of community engagement in pre-composed music, really tries to pose questions about how do we as choral artists, as a field, if we want to present a work like this and use it to engage with other members of the communities that we find around our choral ensembles, what are the kinds of issues of engagement that we need to think through as we present a work like this in a different context? So trying to speak from my own vantage point as a practitioner.
Sound engineer and co-editor of this episode of the SIMM-podcast is musician Mariusz Radwanski. Please visit our website at simplatform.eu.